I can be wrong. My own beliefs are in my song. The butcher, the banker, the drummer, and then makes no difference what group I'm in. I am everyday people. Yeah.
There is a blue one that can't accept the green one, for living with the bad one, trying to be the skinny one. And
Different strokes for different folks. So on and so on, and Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Sha-sha. We got to live together. I am no better, and neither are you. We're all the same, whatever we do. You love me, you hate me, you know me, and then you can't figure out the bag I'm in. I am everyday people. Yeah, yeah.
there is a long hair that doesn't like the short hair, for being such a rich one who will not help the poor one. And
Different strokes for different folks. So on and so on, and Scooby-Dooby-Dooby. Ooh, sha-sha. We got to live together.
there is a yellow one that won't accept the black one, that won't accept the red one, who won't accept the white one. And
Different strokes for different folks. And so on and so on, and Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Ooh, sha-sha. I am everyday people.
Can you believe that song is almost 50 years old? Maybe we'll keep singing it until we get it right. Until we learn that it's not only we got to live together, we get to live together. And that's what we'll be thinking about today. God has a message, a word, something that you see or hear today is meant just for you. So let's take a moment, open our hearts, and just get ready for God's message when it might come to you. Amen.
The first reading for today is from the book of Proverbs. It is the glory of God to hide something, and the glory of kings to discover something. Like the high heavens and the depths of the earth, so the mind of a king is unsearchable. Remove the wicked from the king's presence, and his throne will be established in righteousness. The second reading for today is from the book of James. My brothers and sisters, when you show favoritism, you deny the faithfulness of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has been resurrected in glory. Imagine two people coming into your meeting. One has a gold ring and fine clothes, while the other is poor, dressed in filthy rags. Then suppose that you were to take special notice of the one wearing fine clothes, saying, "Here's an excellent place, sit here." But to the poor person you say, "Stand over there," or "Here, sit at my feet." Wouldn't you have shown favoritism among yourselves and become evil-minded judges? My dear brothers and sisters, listen. Hasn't God chosen those who are poor by worldly standards to be rich in terms of faith? Hasn't God chosen the poor as heirs to the kingdom, who was promised to those who love God? But you have dishonored the poor. Don't the wealthy make life difficult for you? Aren't they the ones who drag you into court? Aren't they the ones who insult the good name spoken over you at baptism? You do well when you really fulfill the royal law found in Scripture. Love your neighbor as yourself. In every way then speak and act as people who will be judged by the law of freedom. There will be no mercy in judgment for anyone who hasn't shown mercy. Mercy overrules judgment. My brothers and sisters, what good is it if people say they have faith but do nothing to show it? Claiming to have faith can't save anyone, can it? Imagine a brother or sister who is naked and never has enough food to eat. What if one of you said, "Go in peace, stay warm, have a nice meal"? What good is it if you don't actually give them what their body needs? In the same way, faith is dead when it doesn't result in faithful activity.
Life often comes down to a series of choices, and we go through our day and we have two options in front of us, and we pick one or the other, and usually we try to pick the one that seems better. And we do this so unconsciously and naturally, we don't usually think about it, but there are ways we kind of get trained in this manner of thinking. For example, when you go to see your optician, she'll put something over your eyes and you'll see something like this. And she'll say, which is better, left or right? This is not a rhetorical question. Which is better, left or right? Okay, excellent. Now which is better, left or right? Very good. Now, this one, left or right? Okay. And next, left or right? Next, which, left or right? Okay. Next slide. Left or right? Okay, I think we have one more. Left or right? Okay. Now these seem like fairly easy questions for most of you, and although some of you disagreed on which was better, if you think about it, probably most of the time you chose the one that you connected personally with, the one that seemed closer to you, where you are in your life, the one that seemed more like you, seemed really obvious, was the right one. And so that answer would change, if I did this little test in Oakland, California, probably the second slide I'd get a different answer, right? And that all seems logical and very usual to us and fairly harmless. But what if we were to try a few more slides? This one. Which is better, left or right? Next. Which is better, left or right? Top or bottom, which is better? And one more, which is better, left or right? These are little different kinds of choices. And, if we're honest, we probably admit that, at least to some extent, we are still drawn to the choice which is closer to what we are, more like ourselves. And yet, we also know that that's probably not where we really want to end up, right? And that set of choices to really say one side or the other is better. So maybe I didn't quite get the optician's instructions quite right. Maybe I forgot something. Doesn't she actually say better, worse, or about the same? And when she says about the same, the letters actually might be different, the actual letters. So to be about the same doesn't mean being identical, but it's about the same clarity, about the same focus, about the same quality of the experience. Better, worse, or about the same. We're looking at the book of James for 5 weeks. This is the second week. And as we talked about last week, the book of James is wisdom literature, which means it's common sense, good spiritual advice. And it lifts up qualities or character traits that if you follow those, you are more likely to align with the Spirit of God. but there's kind of a struggle, a war against the voices in our head that you might call culture or the world or the devil or our society, those voices that pull us in a different direction from the values that James is teaching. Last week, we learned that the voices in our head tell us that life should always be easy and convenient and we should never have to struggle. But James says that the Spirit actually teaches us that we are meant to have challenges and difficulties in life that help us to turn to God and learn to God. And so the value there is endurance. Endurance. The value from today's reading is inclusion. Inclusion. The ability to see the differences in people as being just as valuable as the things that we have in common. And And I got a really interesting example of how the voices in our head teach us something different. Something happened yesterday, and I was so happy because it gave me something to talk about this morning. But on the subject of inclusion, I was doing an email conversation, and it had to do with the language we use here in worship, particularly why we don't refer to God in male terms, as he or as father. And many of us grew up being taught to refer to God that way. Some of us in our personal prayer life, that's still comforting and helpful. But in public worship, we don't do that for a couple of reasons. One is because we've learned that God completely transcends human experience. God is not male or female, but God is both and neither. God is just so far beyond our frame of reference that if we try to limit what we call God, we're going to miss something important in the picture. And then the other reason we don't do it is because some of us, men and women, when we only hear God described in male terms, it's harder for us to remember that women are equally created in the image of God. And so to include the experience of everyone, we simply refrain from referring to God in male terms. If you've ever wondered why we do that, that's why. And that was a little detour, but we were having an email conversation about this, and I was responding. I was typing in the word inclusivity, and my spell check refused that word. It highlighted it in red. And I'm a pretty good speller. And inclusivity is not a particularly hard word, and I kept looking, and it looked right to me. So I right-clicked on the word inclusivity to see what, they suggested instead. They offered exclusivity. My spell check doesn't even recognize the concept of inclusivity. Those are the voices we hear in our heads. The voices that say, it's only what is like us which is valuable. What is not like us is not valuable. Now, of course, it's human nature to go along that way, to start out that way. I remember when I was in New Haven, a couple came to church for the very first time. And after the service, they approached me and they said, "We are so happy to find this church because for months we have been looking for a church with people like us." People like us. And I had no idea what they meant by that. They might have meant lesbians. They might have meant a family with children. They might have meant mid-30s. They might have meant professional. They might have meant white. They might have meant any number of those things or any combination, but I didn't really even care what they meant because my answer was going to be the same. I am so happy. I'm so happy you found a place that you feel comfortable and feel at home and can begin your journey. But after they'd stayed a couple or 3 years, if they had still said, I love this place because there are people just like me here, and that's all I care about, then I wouldn't be happy. Because the Spirit is what takes people where we start and takes us to the point where we value those who are different as much as those who are the same. And if the Spirit's at work in our life and our values are aligning with that, we'll move more and more to that kind of appreciation. The book of James takes this idea and focuses particularly, the example he uses is rich and poor. Rich and poor, both being equally valuable, rich people and poor people in the eyes of God, even though churches, sometimes we don't always act that way. I don't know why churches, and James talks about dress, how people dress. Sometimes churches get really nervous about that. And I have an old story that kind of illustrates that, about a church like that, a church that was very grand with stained glass windows and pipe organ, and everyone who went to this church dressed really, really, really well, dressed to impress. Well, one day a cowboy came in. He doesn't get into town very often, but when he gets in, he likes to go to church. And the clothes that he wore were clean, but that's about all you could say about them. They were pretty well worn. They weren't fashionable. They were pretty modest in appearance. So he came in, he sat in the last row quietly, and he noticed the people around him began to move away. No one came to greet him. But then he saw the pastor walking right down the aisle, right for him, with a big smile, and the pastor walked up, grabbed his hand, pulled him close, and whispered in his ear, before you ever come back to this church, I want you to have a conversation with God and learn what proper attire to worship God in this church would look like. The cowboy says, oh, okay, I'll do that. And he left. Next week, he comes back, and he's wearing exactly the same clothes. And he sits in the same place, and people still move away, and the pastor walks right up to him, only this time he's not smiling, and this time he doesn't whisper in his ear. He shouts right out loud for everyone to hear, I thought I told you before you came back to have a conversation with God. And the cowboy said, well, I did. Well, what did God tell you was proper attire for a church like this? The cowboy says, well, God said, I don't have the slightest idea what's a proper attire for that church. They've never let me in the front door. That's a silly story. But there are more serious stories. Because sometimes the choice to acknowledge the value of those who are different comes at quite a risk. Heard another story. A journalist told us about his great aunt who was Jewish and who lived in Germany during the Nazi years. One day she's riding a bus, and the bus is stopped and boarded by SS troops who begin checking people's paperwork, and those whose papers indicate they're Jewish are taken off the bus and put onto a truck. She realizes what's happening. Her face gets flushed. She begins to tremble and she begins to cry. When the man sitting next to her, a total stranger, whispers, "What's wrong?" And she says, "I don't have the right papers. I'm Jewish. They're going to take me away." Immediately, he wheels around and says, "What do you mean to tell me? I can't believe you are so stupid." And she doesn't, how could this get any worse? And he stands up and says, "This is the last time I'm going to take you home and teach you a lesson." And one of the guards calls back and says, is there a problem back there? And the man turns to the guard and says, oh, it's my wife. She left her papers at home again. I don't know what I'm going to do with her. And the guard laughs and says, oh, my wife's the same way, and passes them by. Now, she never saw that man again and never even learned his name, but gave thanks the rest of her life every day for someone who overlooked the differences that the voices in his head said made her not worthy, and instead followed the Spirit that said that she was. Now, I could stop here. I've probably made my point. But you know what else is interesting about the book of James? Every time the book of James puts out a principle to align ourselves with God, James goes on to say, but it's not enough just to hear it. It's not enough just to believe it. You've got to do it. You've got to do it. You have to practice it. Otherwise, they're just empty words. And we know this is true, right? I believe in exercise. I understand that exercise is good for me. I practice exercise maybe 3 times a year. So is my belief in it doing me any good, really? No. You've got to do it. You've got to practice it. So why not today? Let's do something. Let's do something. Because I saw another example lately of a way a community valued something that was different, and it was a cool example, and I was going to tell you about it. But then it occurred to me, we could just do it. We could do the exact same thing right here, right now. Are you ready? Are you with me? Yes. You're willing? Okay. Here's what it was. About 6 weeks ago, I went to Toronto for a church meeting, which was very thoughtfully scheduled over Pride weekend in Toronto, which is a huge, big deal. 2 million people come in to observe Pride. Went to the parade. It was wonderful. The parade in Toronto is at 2 p.m. on Sunday, which sounds very civilized to me. And that lets the MCC do a worship service at 11 right there on the Pride grounds. I went to this worship service. Now, Pride was July 1st. July 2nd was Canada Day, which is very much like the 4th of July. And so I wasn't too surprised. The very first thing they did in this worship service was sing the national anthem, O Canada. And I'm not paying attention. I'm zoning out. But when they start the second verse, it sounds funny. And I look at the lyrics at the program, and this is what I see. They sang, O Canada, 7 lines, 7 different languages as a way of honoring those whose language is different. I thought that was really cool, so I sang along, and we're going to do this together right now. And before we do, if you don't know the tune, don't worry, because someone around you probably does, and just kind of fake it, and it'll be fine. And if you don't know how to pronounce those words, don't worry. Make something up. It's not about doing it perfectly. It's about trying something new and honoring something that's different, okay? You're ready? Set. Oh, Canada, terre de nos aïeux, qui ai peten, dagwad ke te henang, das Glut, wenn der dich sender, nor our land stark und frei. con valor y pres lealtad amor, bien en bordaste tu blasón. Dios panaviayan, lupeta yang malayay, o janada woman yong yan bao ni, o Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Give yourself a hand. Final slide. Better, worse, about the same. The children know. Can we relearn? Amen.